The next item of business is Stage 1 debate on motion 21650 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the Agriculture, Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to and move the motion for up to 12 minutes. Please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to present the Agriculture, Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill and set out its general principles to Parliament. I want to thank the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee for their consideration of the bill and their report, which expresses support for the bill's general principles, and express gratitude too to the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. And I thank all stakeholders who have submitted evidence to the committee and discussions with myself and my officials. It's important to be clear why we need this bill, what it's intended to address and what it's not. This bill has been developed as a direct result of the UK's decision to leave the EU. I'm sure everyone here knows the Scottish Government believes that EU membership is the best option for both Scotland and the UK, but we are where we are, that's to say, in a current kind of limbo, neither truly part of the EU nor clear about our future relationship with it or indeed the rest of the world. As a responsible government, it's imperative we make sure we have the right legal powers in place to ensure we can continue to support the rural economy and in particular farming and food production. The COVID-19 crisis has brought into sharp relief the importance of secure production and supply of food and the role that farmers and crofters and everyone in the agricultural supply chain plays in this. And I'm extremely grateful to every single person that's doing that work for Scotland and for us all. Clarity and certainty on funding is arguably even more important, and that's why I remain committed to providing financial stability by maintaining current CAP schemes largely intact until 2021, as I promised to do in my stability and simplicity proposals. But these unprecedented times also demonstrate the need for powers to adapt flexibly to changing circumstances and, in particular, to make simplifications and improvements. As part of the preparations needed to leave the EU Common Agricultural Policy is being rolled over into domestic legislation as retained EU law. And this is happening in two stages, Presiding Officer. First, the rules on direct payments became law through UK-wide legislation on exit day at the end of January. And second, the remaining areas of the CAP will become law at the end of the implementation period, currently due to be the 31st December. This is reflected in the powers in Part 1 of the bill, which enable ministers by regulations, first to ensure CAP schemes can continue to operate beyond the end of 2020, second, to make simplifications and improvements to the operation of the legislation governing these schemes, and third, to modify specific aspects of the Common Organisation of the Markets regulation, namely on market intervention, marketing standards and carcass classification. The bill is not intended to create the opportunity to provide powers for making a wholesale change in policy. This is not the purpose of this bill. Now, I know that stakeholders and the REC Committee want to see a legislative commitment on the long-term direction of travel for rural policy through this bill. And whilst I'm sure this will be debated in detail, should the bill progress to stage 2, Presiding Officer, I want to be clear that the reason that this bill does not set such a direction is that this is not its purpose. The bill is instead intended to be the mechanism by which we get to those proposals about long-term policy rather than providing the answers themselves. And that is intended to be and is an important distinction.
Excuse me, Cabinet Secretary. Can I just say to members that I know it's difficult to carry on conversations, but yelling across desks at each other is quite difficult for those of us down the front here. Thank you. Fergus Ewing, Cabinet Secretary, please. Presiding
Officer, I'd also like to briefly address another related recommendation that's been made in the committee's report, that of adding a time limit to some of the powers in the bill by way of a sunset clause restricting their use after 2024. Now, I understand and support the desire to hold the government to a strict timetable, but surely the current unfortunate circumstances with COVID albeit extreme, show that such timetables can be unexpectedly overtaken by events. Yes, I certainly will.
Mike Rumbles.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking intervention. I think everybody accepts that. Everybody's really concerned, that give evidence to the committee, most people anyway, that if there was no sunset clause in there, then it would allow this government or a future government to proceed with payments without the need to introduce any changes to a new system in Scotland. We all want to see a new system in Scotland. The Minister says he'd like to see it by 2024. We're not being prescriptive in the committee. We just said we thought the government should bring forward its own date. May I suggest by the end of the next Parliament would be a good date?
Fergus Ewing.
Well, I thank Mr Rumbles for his suggestion. I know that he is always seeking to be helpful and constructive, and I look forward to debating these things in more detail than perhaps we can today, although I'm sure members will comment on it. The point I'm making is to have a rigid proposal of the sort that has been recommended by some in the committee is not something that I feel makes sense. And I would suggest, and I think Mr Rumbles accepts this, that we are held to account every week about everything. That will continue to be the case. When we come forward with any substantive further policy proposals, we will be held to account. We are, by virtue of being held to account by the REC Committee, open to scrutiny all the time in this Parliament. I can think of very few parliaments where there is more democratic scrutiny, and I welcome that. So I don't think anyone arguing for a sunset clause, and I don't think Mr Rumbles did this, should also suggest that there's an absence of scrutiny. There is a great deal of scrutiny, and I do think that's the fundamental point. And at the end of the day, we're all accountable to the people of Scotland for what we do at elections. Yes, I'll take another intervention, although I think I'll have to abandon most of the speech, but there we are.
I'm deeply sorry to hear that, Cabinet Secretary. But does the Cabinet Secretary accept that one way around the cliff edge that he's concerned about by having a fixed date for a sunset clause would be to have provision for that date to be moved through secondary legislation if circumstances made the government wish to do that and Parliament agreed to that? That would be one way around his concern of having a fixed date and a sunset clause.
Fergus Ewing, and I can allow you a few minutes extra time.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Very generous. Even when I was in mountain rescue teams, I did always conclude that cliff edges were places best avoided altogether. I think shifting it does not seem to me to be an ideal solution, but it is up to Parliament at the end of the day. We will debate this in committee. I welcome that debate. I have not got a closed mind on this, and I want to emphasise that to convener of the committee and all the members of the committee. I know you've discussed this in detail. It requires, and it is right, that we discuss it in more detail than perhaps we can today, but I will most certainly listen with great care to members. But I do think this COVID crisis is really a stark illustration of why governments do need flexibility to be able to act quickly and decisively. And if Parliament decides to so restrain the powers of Parliament that we would be unable to do that without having primary legislation, which, as we all know, is a process that should be undertaken with great care, then I think we would perhaps be risking making a mistake. Presiding Officer, I'm not quite sure how much more time I've got. I certainly try and fill it for you.
I do have some spare time, so I think, unless it's an epic, we can let you get through your speech.
Oh, well, I think I've just got a couple of pages left. So perhaps I can just point out that there are other uncertainties, sadly, with which we are faced at the moment, at the current time, which makes it difficult to do what some stakeholders and some members wish us to do, which is to set all our policy for the future of rural support and farming and food production right now. And these uncertainties include the fact that we do not know what sort of trade arrangements we will have, even with EU and our largest export market. We don't know what tariffs might be imposed on different sectors, such as on lamb exports. We don't know what might be needed to change the current support mechanisms. We do know there's real pressure on milk, on beef. We know there could be real pressure on fruit production, which may or may not be able to be harvested in full. And we know there are also local and international pressures on cereal. not least the fall in the maize price in the USA consequent upon the collapse in the oil price. So there are many, many uncertainties. And I would therefore put it to members that those who say, why haven't you got a fixed policy right now, firstly, don't take into account of those pressures, and secondly, overlook the fact that in our document Stability and Simplicity, we do have what I think is the most detailed exposition of clarity about policy in terms of the financial support of any government in the UK. Yes, certainly.
Mark Ruskell.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way? Of course, there is uncertainty over the nature of future trade deals, but surely the foundation stone of our production in Scotland is about a quality environment and quality produce. Surely those are objectives that can be reflected in this bill.
Fergus Ewing.
Well, we have always espoused those as worthy objectives, and consequential upon that, we have also stressed the importance of ensuring that agricultural produce, for example beef, should not be imported from countries which do not observe the same high qualities as are observed in Scotland. And that's a point that I've made, for example, repeatedly to Michael Gove when he was the DEFRA Secretary, and his answer was the UK government would bring forward equivalence as a legal requirement in a future trade bill. Now, that hasn't happened, and I'm not quite sure if it is going to happen, but if it doesn't happen, then what is to stop there being importation of beef, cheaper beef, from countries that frankly do not observe, according to the views of many, the high standards of animal welfare that are displayed here. And therefore, because that is uncertain, it makes it far more difficult to decide whether or not specific measures are required to be taken. Of course, as an independent country, we would be free to ensure that we can make these kind of decisions ourselves, as Mr Ruskell has alluded to. Turning to the issue of use of the powers, we reiterate the intent to utilise the powers in this bill from 221 to begin the simplifications and improvements that we need towards the new policy approach. And some examples of those are, Presiding Officer, for example, on issues about the severity of the nature of penalties for infractions of rules, often relatively minor ones, changes to the system of inspection, and also the way in which the mapping system deals with small errors. These are some of the nitty-gritty issues that we need to look at, and where I think farmers and crofters would welcome action. I should also just conclude by saying that Part 2 of the bill focuses on the collection and processing of data. The powers that we currently use go back to 1947, when agriculture was very different from today, so we've taken the opportunity to update and improve these powers by making them more clear and transparent and linked to the General Data Protection Regulation and the Data Protection Act 2018. As with Part 1, again, these are issues of technical procedure and process rather than long-term policy, Presiding Officer. So in conclusion, I am appreciative of the recommendations of the committees that the bill be approved by Parliament today. I'm looking forward to listening with care to what members say, and assuming for the moment that members decide to pass the bill, I confirm that I will want to continue to work with them constructively, to be open to discuss possible amendments with them in between stages of the bill, even despite the COVID restrictions, if that is something that members want, to try to work collaboratively, but above all, to make sure we deliver this bill, which is absolutely essential if we are to discharge our duties to farmers and crofters of this country, who are the people who, through work, we continue to have food on our table. Thank you.
I now call Edward Mountain on behalf of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee for around 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to be able to contribute to this debate as convener of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. Before I do so, I should like to remind members of my register of interest in that I am a member of a family farming partnership. The committee published its Stage 1 report on the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill on the 3rd of March. And I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for his letter on the 29th of April, which sets out the Scottish Government's response to the report's recommendations. I would also like to thank everyone who took part in the evidence sessions and gave evidence to the committee during the period that we took it. Overall, the committee supports the bill and is keen to see its progress to facilitate a smooth transition for the agricultural sector following the UK's departure from the European Union. The committee equally recognises the importance of providing greater clarity regarding the development of a long-term rural policy for Scotland. Reflecting the many views of stakeholders, we have called for new primary legislation setting this long-term policy to be brought forward as soon as reasonably possible. Now, looking at the purposes of the bill and the simplification and improvement, multiple stakeholders have raised concern that the bill lacks an overarching policy regarding the simplification and improvement provisions in Section 2 of the bill, which are potentially open to differing interpretations. We recognise the Scottish Government's concern that a purpose clause would preempt the work of the Farming and Food Production Future Policy Group. Nonetheless, we would encourage the Scottish Government to provide greater clarity concerning the underlying principles to be applied in developing measures to simplify and improve CAP legislation. Now, environmental stakeholders have also voiced concerns that the potential relaxation of the rules and red tape via the bill could lead to a regression in standards, including those concerning environmental protection and animal welfare. The Cabinet Secretary has provided helpful reassurance that the Scottish Government has no intention of relaxing these standards. And we note the Scottish Government's intention to address these matters further through its proposed continuity bill and would welcome further detail as the bill progresses as to how such an approach will help to ensure non-regressions in standards. Now, the committee's most significant concern is that the powers in the bill are not time-limited, a view shared by the DPLR Committee, the SLE and the Law Society for Scotland, but to name but a few. The Scottish Government has repeatedly asserted that it intends to use these powers no longer than strictly necessary. Of course, there is continued uncertainty around the length of transition and the need for a development of a long-term policy for Scotland following the UK's departure from the European Union. That is accepted. However, the committee does not think it is appropriate or proportionate for the Scottish Government to have the broad powers conferred in the bill on an indefinite basis. While recognising this is not the current Scottish Government's intention, the power, however, remains within the bill. Thus, a future Scottish Government could use these powers in perpetuity to amend rural policy via secondary legislation without suitable, robust parliamentary oversight. This would be undemocratic. We are therefore calling for a sunset clause that gives due reference to the planned end of the proposed transition period in 2024. We note that the Scottish Government does not support this recommendation. However, we would dispute its contention that our proposed approach would commit a future government to a statutory deadline for implementing wholesale change. The committee are simply proposing that should a future government determine that it needs more time to implement such a change, it should be required to seek the renewed approval of the Scottish Parliament to extend the use of these powers beyond the sunset clause date. This would be democratic. Now, moving on to the marketing standards and carcass classification provisions of the bill, many industry stakeholders have emphasised the crucial importance of maintaining alignment in standards across the UK internal market. This would avoid barriers to the movement and the sale of agricultural products post-Brexit. In this context, we welcome the Scottish Government's repeated assurance that it has no intention of using these powers to disrupt the functioning of the internal UK market. now. Sorry, Presiding Officer. We also share the concerns highlighted by the DPLR committee and various stakeholders, including the NFUS, regarding the blanket use of negative procedures to exercise the powers conferred within Section 2 and Section 8 of the Bill. We welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to reflect further on the procedure to be used in light of our specific recommendations to make these measures to simplify and improve that have wider policy implications and the powers conferred within Section 8 of the Bill, subject to the affirmative procedure. Now, on the collection and processing of data, the committee strongly welcomes the provisions of Part 2 of the Bill, which provide an important update to the legal basis for the collection and processing of agricultural data. We welcome the Scottish Government's clarifications regarding the precise scope of these provisions, in particular that the definition of agricultural activity is restricted to the data collection provisions within the bill and would not affect this definition in any other context, such as for calculating or allocating farm payments. Now, looking at the environmental impact, we, in recognition of the ECCLR Committee's view that proper consideration should be given to the environmental impact of policy measures introduced by the bill, we welcome the Scottish Government's commitment that the environmental impacts of any changes will be robustly assessed during the existing process. Now, I'd like to turn to the long-term rural policy for Scotland. Scotland's agriculture sector has already committed itself to reducing emissions by 75% and to contributing towards a doubling in turnover in farming, fishing, food and drink by 2030. Given these commitments, many stakeholders have argued that the timetable for bringing forward a long-term policy for Scotland lacks urgency. While acknowledging a lack of clarity around the future operating environment for the agriculture sector, we hope the Scottish Government will also recognise there is an urgent need to set out as far as possible how the powers in this bill will help to set Scotland's agricultural industry on a realistic path towards meeting the 2030 commitments. Otherwise, Presiding Officer, we believe there is a genuine risk that these commitments will simply not be met. Now, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, in the short time I've been allowed, I've sought to focus my remarks on certain key issues raised by the committee in its Stage 1 report. I know my colleagues may wish to cover these and other aspects of the report in today's debate. In conclusion, I would like to say the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee recommends that the general principles of the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill be agreed to. We look forward to the further work and considering the potential improvements reflecting the committee's recommendations, and especially and particularly regarding the sunset clause when regarding the bill's progress to Stage 2. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Now call Donald Cameron for around 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by referring to my register of interest, both as an advocate who once specialised in agricultural law and also my crofting farming interests. Indeed, it's unusual to speak in a debate which so neatly unites two of my main interests, law and farming. And the mere mention of mapping errors takes me back to when I represented the Cabinet Secretary's government in the Scottish Land Court in many agricultural subsidy appeals. Let me start by paying tribute to our hard-working farmers, crofters and indeed growers in these difficult and unprecedented times. As I've said in this chamber on many occasions, those who work in our agricultural sector are the custodians of our countryside, and despite these and many other challenges that the sector has faced over the years, Scottish agriculture has continued unabated to provide us with high-quality produce. As a result of the resilience of our agricultural sector, there is an expectation on those of us in this chamber to ensure that as we leave the EU, our farmers, crofters and land managers not only have clarity moving forward, but have a support system which works for them in practice. And we on these benches acknowledge the significant work that the sector itself has carried out to improve environmental standards, increase productivity and drive efficiencies, from planting hedgerows to sequester carbon, using better quality feed to reduce methane output and operating the latest technologies to increase profitability. Our farmers and crofters are at the forefront of delivering for our environment. And it's more important than ever that we continue to support that sector so it can continue on this upward trend. Turning to the legislation before us today, the Scottish Conservatives will be happy to support the bill at stage 1 to give farmers and crofters the security and certainty they need, but with a view to improving it at stages 2 and 3. We acknowledge the need to ensure continuity as we leave the EU and note that at this stage the bill is an overarching one which sets in place the technical structures to allow farmers and crofters to continue to receive support. However, we also recognise the calls from organisations such as the NFUS, who note in consultation with its members that there is an appetite for change and the implementation of a new agricultural policy that better meets the outcomes desired by governments, consumers and the industry in terms of climate change and growth of Scotland's food and drink sector. And other submissions echoed similar themes. Scottish Land and Estate stated that what the industry needs now is bold and ambitious leadership in setting a clear direction of travel for future policy. And the Committee on Climate Change UK acknowledged the same. They said the Scottish Government's plans for a long-term policy framework to replace the EU Common Agricultural Policy are lagging behind both England and Wales. And Deputy Presiding Officer, we share many of those concerns. Now, I accept that the Cabinet Secretary has readily acknowledged both today and in correspondence with the committee that this is a bill about process, not policy, and so already has a very focused purpose. And we too will approach this bill in that spirit, but it will be remiss of me not to mention, as I have just done, the concerns of many stakeholders. And we will continue as a party to press the Scottish Government for further clarity on its policy proposals for future farming support. But we recognise that this is a debate for another day. Can I then address 3 specific aspects of the bill, Deputy Presiding Officer? First, the sunset clause, which has been referred to already. It is clear from reading both the DPLR Committee and the REC Committee's reports on the bill that there is a desire to ensure a sunset clause is included in the bill at stage 2, to ensure that the powers conferred by section 2.1 of the bill do not remain available for an indefinite period. And as Scottish Land and Estates noted in their evidence, lack of a sunset clause means that powers are not time limited and could roll on beyond 2024 and the proposed transition period in stability and simplicity. The REC Committee report also recommends that, as for Section 2, Section 6 of the bill should be subject to a sunset clause. Now, we believe on these benches that such a mechanism will ensure that new policy is indeed brought forward after 2024, rather than allowing retained EU legislation to continue beyond then, with corrections made through the negative procedure. We do not think that would benefit the agricultural sector in the long term, and we can share the concerns of many stakeholders and those who've spoken already in this debate and the respective committees of this Parliament, that it would not be proportionate for the Scottish Government to have the potentially broad power conferred by Section 2 of the bill on an indefinite basis. And we acknowledge that while the Scottish Government still appear to remain opposed to the insertion of a sunset clause, they are open to discussion on the issue, and we welcome that. Secondly, if I could address capping and the issue of a proposed capping system, the bill introduces regulations to modify any provision of the main existing EU cap legislation relating to the setting or determining of ceilings on the amounts of any payments or expenditure for any purpose under the legislation. We acknowledge that these changes are indeed coming down the track from Brussels, but remain cautious that future governments in Scotland may exploit this to reduce funding available to agriculture. And farmers need clarity on what the capping of individual payments would look like. And the NFUS are clear that all funds that are capped must remain within the agriculture portfolio, and potential savings should not be siphoned off into other areas of spending. And I share the views of my colleagues on the REC Committee that we need to scrutinise this effectively. We need regular updates concerning the ongoing development of policy on capping, and the specifics of future funding are required. We believe that capping measures do have the potential to impact larger agri-businesses, and we need, if we start capping, then we need an evidence-based approach because jobs and livelihoods may be at risk, and we urge the government to provide us with more clarity on this section of the bill. Lastly, in terms of the four-nation approach, in leaving the EU, we believe there is an opportunity to maintain the high environmental and animal welfare standards we currently have in place in the UK. We do not want a regression in standards, and we want to be clear that consumers should know that when they purchase Scottish produce, they are buying a product that has passed some of the highest standards in the world. Now, I understand the government still proposed to introduce a new continuity bill that will provide the ability to align any area of Scots law with EU law in areas of devolved competence, so I believe there may be some delay to that as a result of the current coronavirus crisis. But in the meantime, we are firmly of the view that we should keep to the higher standards, but we must be cognizant that greater alignment with the EU over time may well also threaten the integrity of the UK internal signal market, which is so intrinsic to Scottish agriculture. Scotland trades 3 times as much with the rest of the UK than with Europe, and we must be mindful of that proportion when setting any direction in standards. We believe that common UK frameworks must be agreed to ensure a consistency of approach across all 4 nations. In conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Conservatives are happy to support this bill at stage 1. We will look to amend at stage 2 to address the various concerns mentioned, all informed by evidence and reasoned judgment. We remain of the view that in terms of future policy, we need further clarity from the Cabinet Secretary as to the specific nature of a new farm support model, and soon. This bill purposefully does not provide such clarification, but it does crucially provide farmers with certainty over continuing payment and the mechanism for those payments. And for that reason, it has our support today. Thank you.
Call Colin Smith for around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is an important bill. I recognise the need for it to be passed, and I recognise the need for us to do so swiftly to provide certainty for farmers and crofters for future payments. So I'm happy to support the bill at stage 1. But I do think, Presiding Officer, our constituents may be asking why, in the current crisis, has the government insisted this is the first substantive debate this Parliament has held for some months, and not a debate on the impact on their communities, including our rural communities, of the COVID-19 pandemic. I genuinely regret that this debate is taking place in a way that is excluding many members, including those who will have contributed to the stage 1 report we are debating today. Here in the Scottish Parliament, we should be leading by example, following best practice and advice. We're telling high-risk people to stay at home, but saying to anyone who wants to participate in this debate today, they must attend in person. We're telling businesses to make adjustments to enable home working, but failing to do so ourselves in a way that would allow members who cannot be here today to contribute to the debate through video. That's not how workplaces should be operating during this crisis, and it's certainly not how legislation should be made. Labour has called for this debate to be delayed until Parliament puts in place the technology to allow digital participation. I'm disappointed those calls were not supported from other parties in this chamber. This COVID-19 crisis has shone a light on so many issues in government announcements that are simply not being fully debated in this chamber: testing, PPE availability, economic support for our communities. Presiding Officer, the COVID-19 crisis has also underlined the importance of a strong agriculture sector and a robust food supply chain. It's exposed the vulnerabilities in our food system, but it's also highlighted the sheer resilience of workers within our critical food and drink sector. So I want to begin by expressing my heartfelt thanks to all those workers for their at times heroic efforts, from the farmers fighting to rescue the summer harvest to those in our supermarkets working round the clock to keep essential supplies on our shelves. Their work has allowed us to avoid the major food shortages we feared, and we owe them all a huge debt of gratitude. They should not have had to ask 32 individual local councils to be designated as key workers. But while the sector's hard work and innovation mitigated the worst impact of the sudden shift in demand from the food service sector to food retailer and the halt in people being able to move freely, the vulnerability of supply chains to major upheaval has been clear for all to see. The capacity to adjust rapidly and without chaos and cost is seriously limited, and we cannot ignore the precarious nature of our food system. The sector has responded well to this crisis, but we should not be dependent on a largely reactive response. We need a more strategic, joined-up approach to managing our food system and robust contingency planning to ensure the sector is prepared for any future emergencies. We need to better link food and farming policy together and properly recognise its role in health, the environment and poverty. And we need to end the siloed approach with a more cohesive and comprehensive policy on food, from the farm to the fork to waste. One way to help deliver this would be through the development of a national food plan, a statement of policy as proposed in the consultation on the Good Food Nations Bill. While the decision to shelve the Good Food Nations Bill was perhaps unavoidable, it is still disappointing that this important piece of legislation will not get a chance to progress. But that should not mean that we drop all the elements of that bill. I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to look at what from the Good Food Nations Bill could now be incorporated in this agriculture bill. The world has changed since this bill was first drafted and the Stage 1 report was written. We need to change with it, starting by looking at how we can amend this bill to underpin the development of a national food plan as recommended by the Scottish Food Coalition. Presiding Officer, there are other changes to the bill that are also needed. The bill provides powers for Scottish ministers to make changes to common agricultural policy legislation to simplify or improve its operation and enable pilot schemes. But what constitutes simplification or improvements is not defined. The scale and purpose of any pilots still remains unclear. So we need more detail on the government's plans for the transition period, what they want to achieve from the investment in agriculture and wider rural economy, and clear direction for the future to provide as much certainty as we can for the sector at this time. That clarity could be improved by, as we've heard already, the inclusion of a purpose clause on the face of the bill. In our Stage 1 report, the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee highlighted, and I quote, the views expressed by multiple stakeholders that the bill lacks an overarching purpose or direction. In his response, the Cabinet Secretary expresses concerns about setting a statutory direction of travel that proves impossible to deliver due to uncertainty about the future. But for me, this uncertainty is exactly why we need a statutory purpose clause, a key set of values at the heart of policy making. It's not true to say that a purpose clause would preempt the work of the Farming and Food Policy Group. It is the role of government and Parliament to provide leadership in policy making. A purpose clause would set high-level objectives to guide policy making during the transition period and as we begin to develop our long-term strategy. The need for more detail from government is also essential, given the broad regulation-making powers created in this bill. I appreciate the need for secondary legislation to be used here, but Parliament cannot be expected to write the government a blank cheque. So I would echo the Law Society of Scotland's call for more requirements for consultation and the use of affirmative procedure to provide greater parliamentary scrutiny where appropriate. This is particularly relevant to powers allowing ministers to simplify or improve the operation of CAP legislation, given the broadness of this language. At a minimum, the use of this power should be subject to adequate consultation and parliamentary scrutiny. More broadly, this power and others must be time-limited. This will address concerns about these sweeping regulations, making powers being available to ministers indefinitely, and reiterate the Scottish Government's commitment to bringing forward a new system by 2024. Now, I recognise the concerns the Cabinet Secretary outlined in his opening comments, but I also said these concerns over a fixed date could be avoided by including a mechanism for ministers to extend the duration of the bill by secondary legislation if necessary. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought home to us all the importance of food, but it's exposed the fragility of supply chains as we only narrowly avoided major shortages in our supermarkets, and many vulnerable people still can't book home delivery slots for their essential groceries. It has sadly highlighted the vulnerability of many families, with the Food Foundation estimating that 3 million families across Great Britain have gone hungry during the lockdown. It has revealed a new desire for local produce, with more people, for example, using farm shop and dairy local deliveries for their supplies. But we've also all witnessed the scenes of farmers pouring milk down the drain as it's unused. If ever there was a need for a better contingency plan when it comes to food supplies and a national food plan, it is now. So let's wake up to the fact the world has changed and use this bill as an opportunity to put in place a national food plan. Thank you.
Now call Mark Ruskell for around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I thank the committee for their thorough Stage 1 report on the bill, and can also send John Finney's best wishes to the Chamber for this debate this afternoon. The COVID crisis has certainly brought many issues to the fore, and not least the vulnerability of our food system and the vital contribution that food sector workers make to our society, from the producers through to the fruit pickers, the processors, the independent shop owners, and the women and men staffing our checkouts. Crises hone our sense of what is important, and there are few more important things than having access to fresh, affordable and healthy food. Now, the Scottish Greens recognise the role of public subsidy in supporting our food system and in delivering good management of our land and the wider environment. So we will be supporting the general principles of the bill today. We recognise the uncertainty farmers have faced since the referendum in 2016 and the difficulties that still remain in designing a clear agricultural support system for a Scotland out with the EU, but closely aligned to it. And in this regard, the transition period that the bill facilitates and the research and the development work and the pilot work it proposes is welcome. However, we agree with many stakeholders that this bill sorely lacks an overarching purpose and direction for how its powers should be used. The question remains, what are we transitioning to? What outcomes will we be seeking from the pilots? And how will we judge success? The bill as it stands gives ministers extensive powers without addressing these questions or providing any guidance as to how the said powers should be used. Environment Link have called on the Parliament to agree a purpose for the allocation of future agricultural support and have collated a comprehensive list of outcomes for future support schemes. These are about recognising that we face a twin climate and nature emergency. Outcomes must tackle these crises head-on while building resilient food production systems that are able to withstand the inevitable shocks to come. Including these broad outcomes in legislation would not hinder the development of pilot schemes or the simplification of existing legislation, but it would provide clear direction and certainty to industry, government and Parliament. Presiding Officer, farmers plan for decades, if not generations ahead. They need to know that politicians and government are willing to do the same. And while uncertainty exists about how much subsidy money there will be in 5 years, or what type of trade deal the UK may end up with, Scotland's strengths are clear. The quality of our environment and food go hand in hand. And while we may never be able to compete with more intensive forms of food production, whether those are within the UK or outside of the EU, we have to build on our strengths. That's a clear certainty. It's a clear certainty which should build the objectives for the future. The NFUS have urged ministers to drive forward the development of policy as a matter of urgency, while Scottish Land and Estates have also called for a purpose clause to be inserted at stage 2. Meanwhile, as we've already heard, the Scottish Food Coalition has called for the bill to require ministers to set out a broader statement of policy on food, and I'd encourage the government to carefully consider this proposal. The requirement for this statement was a core part of the Good Food Nation bill, which has now been indefinitely postponed. Such a policy statement would have greatly influenced the delivery of a new agricultural support system, including how subsidies can be used to build resilience and diversity in the supply chain, deliver on public health outcomes, and address social justice issues around food. Now, I appreciate that the bill seeks to deal with specific mechanisms of farm payments, but considering financial support on its own, with no consideration of the wider policy framework that should influence those payments, is exactly the kind of silo thinking that Good Food Nation bill was supposed to address. Given much of the development and consultation work for the statement of policy on food has already been carried out, I urge again the government to consider how it can be included in the bill at stage 2. I note the reassurance that government has given that there will be future consultation on the wider agricultural policy, but given the long list of advisory groups and roundtables convened by the Cabinet Secretary since 2016, I'm perplexed as to why we do not have a comprehensive agricultural policy ready to go right now today. Time is running out. It's running out in the monumental task we have to deliver a 75% reduction in climate emissions in 10 short years. That's the end of session 7. That's not a lot of time to turn the corner and to cut emissions in a way which is also delivers a successful agricultural food economy in Scotland. Our new Climate Act includes a framework for farming objectives. These have to be reflected in the new climate plan, which will be scheduled for December this year. And the UK Climate Change Committee have been critical of the lack of progress from the government so far. It would be unthinkable to have a revised climate plan without a clear policy on agriculture to accompany it. We must ensure our farmers can continue to receive the stable support they've enjoyed under the CAP. But to miss this opportunity to clearly set out the environmental, social and health outcomes that we want our farmers to be delivering on would be a dereliction of our duty as parliamentarians, and it must be fixed through this bill.
Call Mike Rumbles for around 6 minutes, please.
Can I say at the outset that the Liberal Democrats support this bill? It's a very necessary bill which, amongst other things, makes sure that agricultural support payments to businesses up and down the land can be paid by the Scottish Government after the end of this year. This is even more important during the current crisis, when so many enterprises throughout Scotland are going through such difficult times. And I'm pleased that this bill should continue its progress through the parliamentary process to become law. The importance of this bill can be seen by the very broad support for it from the stakeholders called to give evidence to the committee during the lead-up to this debate. Because this bill allows the government time to develop primary legislation to implement their bespoke agricultural policy post-2024, which is the date it has set itself to have this on the statute book. The one point of controversy I wish to focus on relates to the very broad powers which this bill will give to Scottish ministers in Section 3, headed the power to provide for the operation of CAP legislation beyond 2020. It says, and I quote, "Scottish ministers may by regulations modify the main CAP legislation for the purpose of securing that the provisions of the legislation continue to operate in relation to Scotland for 1 or more years beyond 2020. Now, it's clear why the government don't want to put an end date of 2024 in this legislation, because they're concerned that they might not be in a position to have their new primary legislation in place by then. Now, I do understand this point, and again reiterated by the Cabinet Secretary this afternoon. I do understand it, but it does cause a problem. The majority of our witnesses to the committee expressed concerns that Section 3, as currently written, would allow the current Scottish Government, or indeed any future government, to delay or even fail to implement primary legislation needed to support the new agricultural policy which everybody wants to see for Scotland post-2024. So, quotes from just 3 organisations who've given evidence to the committee. Johnny Hall, very impressive evidence. Johnny Hall of the Scottish National Union of Farmers said, and I quote, "Some sort of sunset clause, which is what we are talking about here, would be advantageous, but the time limit needs to be thought through very carefully." Yvonne White of the Scottish Crofting Federation said, "As it stands, the power in Section 3 of the bill will be available in perpetuity. There are concerns about the CAP legislation continuing to operate in perpetuity." The Law Society said, quote, "Given that the stated intentions of the Scottish Government that this is a transition bill with work ongoing in relation to future policy, we question whether the powers under the sections of this part, in particular those powers in sections 2 to 4, should be time limited by the introduction of sunset provisions. The powers in the bill could be used by any future government and may not be done in line with the intentions of the current government." The current government might not be here forever. Even the DPLR committee, when it examined the bill, oh, steady on, come on, steady on, examined the bill, called for a sunset clause, although it suggested a date of 2030. It's the view of the members of the Rural Economy Committee that this is far too extended a date. I want to refer to the unanimous view, of the members of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee by quoting our recommendation, because I think it's worth quoting. We said, "The committee endorses the view expressed by the DPLR committee, with the exception of its proposal that a sunset clause should be extended to 2030, which it considers to be too far in the future. It therefore calls on the Scottish Government, as the bill progresses to stage 2, to bring forward proposals for a sunset clause extended to a date that gives due reference to the planned end of the transition period on 2024. I don't think we're hung up on 2024. I know that the bill, as lodged, has been framed with the best of intentions. It is, though, the job of parliamentarians to critically examine the bill to see how it can be improved. This is our job, and is, of course, the very purpose of this Stage 1 debate. I do hope that the Cabinet Secretary will acknowledge that there are very real and legitimate concerns about Section 3 among stakeholders, which have been highlighted by the committee in its report and by MSPs across the chamber so far this afternoon. I am pleased that the Cabinet Secretary said today that his mind wasn't closed to looking at a sunset clause, and will be working with members across the chamber at stage 2 to see how this could be improved to everybody's satisfaction. I go back to the evidence given by Johnny Hall of the NFU. The time limit needs to be thought through very carefully. We don't want to restrict the actions of the Scottish Government, but we don't want to have it in perpetuity. I would like to see the Cabinet Secretary bring forward himself a government amendment to time limit this bill, perhaps to the end of the next parliamentary session in 2026, giving plenty of time to bring forward primary legislation for the new and bespoke agricultural policy for Scotland that we all accept and we all want to see happen. That would ensure that we can all move forward together, and I think that's important if we can move all forward together to pass this much needed transition bill. Thank you.
We now move to the open debate and speeches of around 6 minutes, please. Maureen Watt, followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm glad that today we're at last having this debate, as this piece of legislation was considered by the Rural Economy and Connectivity quite a while ago. And I note that a number of organisations, including NUF Scotland, want to see this bill proceed with some speed in order to provide a degree of certainty about payments in this otherwise very uncertain times. I regret that some of my committee colleagues are not here in person to deliver their views on the bill, on the Stage 1 report, but I know that a number of them have been in conversation with myself and other speakers today. Throughout the consideration of evidence, there were many who wanted this bill to do more than it's intended to do. This bill is not a vehicle to overhaul CAP or completely revise the way payments are made to farmers and the rural economy more generally. And thank goodness for that. As current events have shown, the bill would possibly be largely irrelevant and or would have to be scrapped or heavily amended. This bill is about process. It's required as a result of the calamitous decision of the UK to leave the EU, which is regarded by the vast majority of Scots as a flawed decision, and even more so now in the situation we find ourselves. CAP will cease to apply at the end of 2020. We must, as a Parliament, therefore, take the necessary steps to continue to support our farmers and crofters. Agriculture is devolved, and it is right and proper that this Parliament puts in place its own policy on this matter. Of course, come time, there will be a requirement for a definitive bill on agricultural policy and payments going forward, but thank goodness the government did not rush into doing this now. Stability and simplicity, as the government's response in 2018 to consultation on EU exit, seems now very apt. Stability and simplicity. And I think Parliament, as the committee suggests, should accept the Scottish Government commitment not to use this legislation any longer than is required. Presiding Officer, as a result of the global pandemic, the term food security is taken even more impetus and importance than before. Therefore, I hope that those advocating a sunset clause will now agree with the NFUS and others and realise that it is inappropriate and not required given the government commitment set out in its response to this Stage 1 report. Given the nervousness of many of us being here and the disruption to the Parliament timetable, it seems even more appropriate now that a sunset clause should be installed. As a result of change being required, the government is committed to some pilots on the innovative workings of agriculture, and I suspect due to the interruptions that the Cabinet Secretary had during his opening speech. He perhaps didn't have time to say anything about those, but if he could in his summing up, I think that would be welcome by many. The bill addresses the need for alignment in standards and the need for standardisation across the UK marketplace. I think most of us in this place would rather see a commitment to standards that were still very much aligned with the rest of the EU. But the main driver, as always in this, must be in the best interests of the Scottish agricultural industry and Scottish consumers. And I'm sure the people of Scotland expect nothing less from the Scottish Government. The bill gives the ability to cap agricultural payments, and I think this is broadly welcome. Many are horrified at the amounts of taxpayers' money given to already very wealthy farmers, and it is welcome that future payments will be based on output rather than area-based. And in relation to this, it's worth noting the data collection aspects of the bill. During the evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary, he reassured me that there would not be more information required as a result of this bill, but it is important that it is collected in the most up-to-date ways and is relevant. And it's most important to be credible that the information gathered is used to the maximum benefit of the nation and their taxpayers' money. I said to my colleague Emma Harper that I would mention something that she would have brought up if she was here, and it's in relation to the producer organisations mentioned in the bill. Emma represents 48% of Scotland's dairy farmers in her South of Scotland region, and she is very worried about the continuity of supply, for example, of milk, and she asked me specifically, Cabinet Secretary, to clarify in your closing remarks whether this bill supports initiatives such as producer organisations and fruit and vegetable organisations, which can be hugely beneficial to farmers. So I think I would also wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could say a bit more in relation to the Agricultural Transformation Fund, because anything that we do now has to be in the context of our commitments to mitigating climate change. So at decision time, I will be supporting the bill.
Call Liz Smith to be followed by Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I intimate straight away that this contribution is very much on behalf of my colleague Peter Chapman, who is unable to be present in the Chamber. And he reminded me last night that one of the most important things I should say is to draw members' attention to his register of interests. So, notwithstanding the fact that it is really Peter's contribution, I actually, as a member for Mid Scotland and Fife, very much welcome the opportunity to speak this afternoon. And I heard what Mr Smith said earlier, that Labour was not very content about this debate. And I understand that the focus is all about COVID-19, but I actually think this bill is very important because it matters to an awful lot of people in a hugely important sector. And I think we should not forget that while it is about process, that process matters about how we will support the agricultural sector in the future. So like the rest of my colleagues in the Scottish Conservatives, we are very supportive of the general principles of the bill. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree that it must be a smooth transition of our ability to make payments to the agricultural sector as the UK leaves the EU. That is obviously absolutely essential, especially when it comes to allowing farm support payments to be made post-Brexit, and the desire for simplicity and stability after the initial exit from the EU. That obviously has to be very welcome. Indeed, I think the COVID-19 crisis has shown just how important it is to have built-in resilience within the agricultural industry to maintain the supply lines and keep food on family tables. I thought Mark Ruskell made a very important point about that. As such, I think it's easy to argue that this bill has actually become even more important now than it was before, because we owe our agricultural sector so much and it's very critical to the well-being of our society. Now, we know that the bill focuses only on the short to medium-term future from now until 2024, That will take us almost halfway through to our ambitious 2030 targets of a 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and a doubling of our output to 30 billion, and as such leaves only 6 years to enact the large-scale changes needed in order to meet those very challenging targets. And if the industry is to have any chance of doing this, it obviously needs far greater understanding of the support mechanisms and of the delivery of the direction in which we're going. To emphasise, I think a substantial reduction of emissions within the agricultural industry, coupled with a desired target of doubling turnover in farming, fishing and food and drink to 30 billion without clear policy, is perhaps wishful thinking in the best. And it is in this vein that my colleagues have been arguing for the longer-term sustainable rural policy for Scotland, put before Parliament as soon as it is reasonably possible, thereby giving the industry as much time as possible to enable efficient, effective and environmentally beneficial practices. We welcome the use of pilot schemes and acknowledge the many benefits of trialling policy changes to identify and inform longer-term policy development. However, the Scottish Government must keep Parliament and, most importantly, the industry up to date as to what these pilot schemes are and how they will operate. There needs to be full clarity and full transparency going forward. The renewed focus on an outcome-based as opposed to an area-based approach to the calculation and allocation of farm payments is welcome. One of the few assets from Brexit, and in my view they are few, will be our ability to design a bespoke system for agriculture that fits Scotland's farmers' needs and desires. So it is good to see that the Cabinet Secretary is responding to that. Presiding Officer, there is also a need for further assurance at stage 2 that there will be no relaxation on environmental and animal welfare standards as a result of the bill. The issue concerning standards needs to be subject to common framework discussions with the UK Government. This is imperative to protect the integrity of the internal UK market and to avoid any potential barriers to the movement and sales of products post-Brexit. There needs to be assurances that the Scottish Government will not needlessly diverge from the rest of the UK, upon which Scottish agriculture is so heavily dependent. The committee was obviously in general agreement that the use of the negative procedure should be amended. Section 2 of the bill gives ministers sweeping powers to modify regulations relating to direct payments, transfers and funding. Without additional safeguards, the powers conferred in this bill could be used to amend rural policy without parliamentary scrutiny, and that is clearly not an acceptable situation. So that's why the sunset clause that has been spoken about so eloquently by Mike Rumbles and by the convener Edward Mountain is so important. One contentious issue is the possibility of capping individual payments. If a government decides on that, it must be done in a fair and proportionate manner. It needs to be recognised that farms receiving large payments are regularly and intimately involved in agri-environment schemes and employ significant members of staff. Any schemes must consequently see wide-ranging consultation before progressing. So in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, we welcome the general principles of the bill and the need for simplicity and stability post-Brexit. This bill has the potential to make major changes to the agricultural industry in the next few years. It will have implications in a world where COVID-19 looks set to stay for some time. Change is inevitable, and the industry accepts and expects that we will have to urge the Minister to grasp that opportunity and give our farmers the guidance and clarity they need by using the ability to pilot new schemes as soon as possible. Thank you.
Angus MacDonald, followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, President Officer. I think it's fair to say that everyone who has the agriculture industry at heart would like to see this bill done and dusted as soon as possible. So I'm pleased we have this stage 1 debate in the Chamber today to help move it forward. I also think it's fair to say stakeholders are broadly on the same page, and it is good to see common ground between the Scottish Government and industry bodies such as the NFUS and the Scottish Crofters Federation. Now, we know that it's the NFUS's view that the smooth passage of this bill is vital in order to ensure stability and certainty in the period immediately following the UK's departure from the EU, and as the agriculture sector plays its role in post-COVID-19 recovery. And never more important than now, as we see the UK careering towards the cliff edge of a no-deal Brexit at the end of the year, and it's with this last point in mind that many stakeholders welcomed the proposal for public intervention and private storage aid. Section 5 of the bill gives Scottish ministers powers relating to intervention purchasing or paying private companies to store product rather than placing it immediately on the market. Now, clearly, none of us want to see a return to the EU's discredited milk lakes or butter mountains, and no one is suggesting anything on that scale, clearly. However, these provisions are designed to enable public authorities to manage prices in agricultural markets during periods of market volatility. And while none of us, I'm sure, would wish to see intervention used, if we do have to endure a no-deal Brexit, the legislation may be required sooner rather than later. Indeed, evidence submitted to the committee from Stephen Thompson, a policy advisor at Scotland's Rural College, stated, and I quote, "There also needs to be scope to maintain intervention. The EU has that potential and America uses it in emergencies. We need to have the scope for storage and intervention in the markets in exceptional circumstances. A hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit may be such an exceptional circumstance in which we might need scope for that far sooner than we think." End quote. Of course, these provisions would only be used in market crisis situations, but as the Cabinet Secretary explained to us in oral evidence to the committee, the government was already looking at an exceptional circumstance which would require intervention using the powers conferred by Section 5 of the bill, and that is, or was, and maybe again, preparations previously made to create a compensation scheme for sheep meat in the event of the UK leaving the EU without a deal, which would, and still could, result in the introduction of significant tariffs on sheep meat exports, as the Cabinet Secretary alluded to in his opening speech. So, for me, Presiding Officer, this is a very important aspect of this bill, which gives some comfort to the industry, which is why there has been widespread industry support for the inclusion of these powers and highlights the strong possibility that public intervention might yet be required to protect specific agricultural sectors in Scotland against specific exceptional circumstances, for instance, in the event of a no-deal exit from the EU. Now, turning to the issue of the Sunset Clause, which has had quite a bit of coverage already today, I noted the Cabinet Secretary's comments in his opening speech in relation to the Sunset Clause, in which he said, and I paraphrase, "Now is not the time." Now, clearly, the committee at the time of signing off the report endorsed the view of the DPLR committee that there should be a sunset clause, but not DPLR's view that it should be extended to 2030. But that was then, and this is now. It has to be said that when the Stage 1 report was published on the 3rd of March, it was before we knew the impact of coronavirus. Now, we have ambitious targets ahead in agriculture, not least in doubling the value of Scotland's food and drink sector under Ambition 2030. But that brings challenges as well, not least ensuring over the same period that Scottish agriculture makes a significant contribution to the 75% reduction in greenhouse gases and then onwards to net zero by 2045. So while stability and simplicity is required and is a must over the coming years up to 2024, another must is the need to ensure that the development of policy for the sector post-2024 is driven forward by the Scottish Government with an objective of bringing forward new primary legislation as soon as is reasonably possible in order to ensure the enactment of a new policy that goes beyond the stability and simplicity approach. Now, it's worth noting, Presiding Officer, that the NFUS, whilst recognising the aspirations and intentions of including a sunset clause in the bill, it now has concerns with such an approach, particularly with fixing such a date in legislation. It is the position of the NFUS that fixing a sunset clause in legislation could equally constrain agriculture if, by 2024, the wider operating environment resulting from the UK-EU trade discussions or other current unknowns that could be destabilising, such as economic, environment or social issues, is such that stability and certainty in agricultural policy is still required. As the NFU stated, and I quote, "It is impossible to predict what political, market, regulatory and economic operating environment the agricultural industry will be operating in by 2024. And it is for that reason that the NFUS believes that the Scottish Government should not be legislatively bound to implement a new agricultural policy by this date or any other specific date. That said, though, it's fair to say that development of future policy beyond stability and simplicity must get underway as soon as possible to ensure the industry keeps up with the direction of travel. So in closing, Presiding Officer, I look forward to the forthcoming stages 2 and 3 of this bill, and also the Cabinet Secretary's summing up in the hope that he will have a bit more to say regarding the sunset clause, in particular that this is not the time for an arbitrary statutory timescale for wholesale change to rural support services as we try to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Rhoda Grant to be followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While I recognise this bill is necessary, it is not urgent, and we shouldn't be debating anything but our response to COVID-19 and emergency legislation while not all members can attend to vote, and while this Parliament cannot pass legislation virtually. We're also asking people to stay at home unless their reason for leaving is to contribute to the fight against COVID-19, and this legislation today does not do that. Therefore, we're setting a poor example. It's unacceptable that the Scottish Government has forced us to break the COVID-19 regulations that they have set. There are also members of the committee who took evidence on this bill today who can't be here. We can't learn what they have learnt from that, taking that evidence. So there's a difficulty in the processes of the Parliament where those who are supposed to inform this chamber today on the bill are not present and cannot be present. While the bill is necessary, it's not urgent. Neither does it deal with the shape of farming and farming support going forward. There's no vision and no ambition. It's just the same old on offer. The Scottish Government should have been planning for what will replace CAP, the form it will take, and the public goods required from crofters and farmers in return for that public support. But unfortunately, they've squandered that opportunity. And the Cabinet Secretary said today that this will provide stability until 2021. That's next year. Anyone who knows anything about farming and crofting knows that a year does not provide stability for them. They need to know the direction of travel. So they will end up, our crofters and farmers, with no idea of what is to come and what public goods will be supported going forward. COVID-19 makes everyone's future more precarious, and government should be providing certainty where that is possible. We have always said public money must pay for public goods, and these goods must include supporting local economies and providing jobs and income. And I'll give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you to Rhoda Grant for giving way. Could I just make it absolutely clear that we believe that the stability should be continued to be provided until 2024, and moreover that from 2021, in addition to the continued support that farmers know they can have and will therefore be able to know that they will get for the years until 2024, we'll be trying pilot schemes of new initiatives. So the stability continues not till 2021 but to 2024 under our plan.
Rhoda Grant.
And that suggests to me that there will be no change in policy until 2024. How on earth is farming and crofting going to meet its climate change challenges if there is no change to how support is distributed before 2024? We need a joined-up policy, and we need joined-up policy throughout departments. For years we've been telling crofters and farmers to diversify to make a living, and yet that diversification could mean that they're not getting the financial help they require during this COVID crisis. So all arms of government need to sign up for a policy and to support it. For instance, things like asking farmers and crofters to look at the hospitality industry, and now their self-catering accommodation does not attract any support. The bill does not address the food chain either, and the difficulties we've seen exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. We hear of people not being able to access food, either because they must isolate and can't, or that they cannot afford it. And then in contrast, we see farmers pouring milk down the drain because they have no market for it. It's absolutely obscene. It's heartbreaking for those of us who have plenty to watch. I can't imagine how it must feel to those who are hungry and whose families are hungry, and yet this bill does nothing about that. The industry is crying out for labour. Crops are going to rot in the fields, which could lead to a food shortage. Yet again, this bill does nothing about that. What this bill is going to do, how can it support those businesses with finance and support them through this crisis? But that finance cannot stop crops rotting in the field. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, access to food is a big issue, and yet the bill doesn't deal with that. If ever we should be looking at an agriculture policy from field to fork, it's now. 3 million people in Britain have gone hungry during the lockdown. 1.5 million have gone a whole day without eating, and 7.1 million have had to reduce or skip meals because they can't afford enough for everyone in the household. This is pretty grim. And yet the Good Food Nation bill has been delayed due to the pandemic, rather than treating it as urgent. And because of this, at the very least, this agriculture bill must include a right to food until such time as we can get comprehensive legislation on a Good Food Nation bill. Presiding Officer, agriculture and access to food are intrinsically linked, but the government has too often taken a siloed approach to policy and legislation. This has happened historically, and families are suffering from this policy now. This is an opportunity to change that, and yet it has not been taken by this government.
Thank you very much. I now call Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know that Parliament's endeavouring to continue business at this most difficult of times, and I commend Parliament staff for the huge effort they've put in to ensure that members and their constituents continue to be represented. I know the Parliament are currently looking at proxy voting to give members who cannot be heard their voice, and I was hoping that this speech would be the first proxy speech, but I appear to be beaten to it slightly. You see, my colleague and friend Stuart Stevenson, who sits in the Rural Economy Committee and represents the very large food-producing constituency of Banffshire and Buchan Coast, cannot be here, as he's in the category of those who must shield, although I say only just. I want to endeavour in a small way to echo his voice this afternoon. I've been liaising with him as to the points he would like to make in this Stage 1 debate. I've stopped short of paying further tribute to him by wearing his galluses, tempting as that was, but I believe that our hairstyles are similar at the moment. Stuart tells me that fields that he walks past near his home in Boyndy for his daily exercise at the beginning of his 7 weeks of lockdown were winter-torn and largely bare. But when I spoke to him yesterday, he recounted that he walked past the same fields and you could see spring barley 9 inches tall in those same fields. And he had thoughts about how easy it would be to imagine that there was only a few weeks' work by the farmer to transform a field from winter to spring. But of course, we know better. That barley is long in the planning. The farmer's decision as to what to plant was made at least as far back as last autumn, and possibly even earlier, as she or he made financial projections that enabled a decision as to how much seed to order, and they made assessments on the potential market for the crop. As they made these calculations, they knew that they were part of a chain of suppliers and buyers who were making similar calculations. The sheep farmers will have to consider the potential for the lamb sales later this year when they put the ewes to the tuck last year. They were probably cautious, as they might have foreseen difficulties in selling to France, which we all know is a very important market for Scottish lamb. And we know that lamb producers in Scotland are particularly worried about post-Brexit trade agreements. And Angus MacDonald has mentioned other issues in relation to the lamb sector. But we can be quite certain, what we can be quite certain about is that no Scottish farmer will have incorporated a viral pandemic into their spreadsheet projections last autumn. If we let that difficulty translate into reduced farming profitability, we face the prospect of less of our own homegrown food on our tables. And this just simply cannot happen from an economic, social and environmental perspective, and also from a health perspective too. So the agricultural bill before us this afternoon is more vital in content than ever, and most critical is its timing and an ability to be fleet of foot as we recover from this crisis and help our agricultural sector through the difficulties that lie ahead with Brexit as well. Only by giving our farmers and crofters and all the businesses who work with them and rely on them certainty about the support they will receive will their actions in planning for 2021 and beyond preserve this most vital of industries. So how will this bill help and why now? Well, let's deal with the now. Few farmers are without an overdraft. In the words of Stuart Stevenson, banks' sentiment towards their agricultural creditors is unlikely to improve, he says, and their margins are being squeezed by a nearly or actually zero base rate. Some certainty on the farmers' balance sheets will help keep the banks at bay, and of course he speaks as an ex-banker himself. The earlier we can act to deliver certainty, the better the outcome. A pound promised now and guaranteed through legislation is worth a lot more than a pound promised in September, even if we were to reach the relevant bank account on the same day, because in a crisis, too many creditors will seek to minimise adverse outcomes by calling in loans if bad looks as if it might be followed by disastrous. Lenders or trade creditors winna hing about, as they say in Stuart's constituency. They will want to recover as fast as possible. The bill's most important purpose for farmers is to enable common agricultural policy schemes to continue from the 1st of January 2021. Farmers have already been promised that, but we must not delay progress towards creating a statutory framework, especially at a time when there are so many other sources of uncertainty for everyone. There are not many areas when we can give certainty right now, so when a chance does come along, we have a duty to do so. If we increase doubt by our not progressing this legislation, it will simply translate into more difficulty onto the balance sheets of farmers and crofters. It's Stuart's view that this bill does not change any policy. What it does do is provide some of the powers to do so in the future with the consent of Parliament. He believes most strongly that it's an essential part of protecting the support for our farmers that previously came as part of our membership of the EU Common Agricultural Policy, and also representing a large rural and agricultural constituency myself, one of the neighbouring ones to Mr Stevenson's. I'm in complete agreement with that. The noises from Westminster are clear, despite some very strong objections on social and economic grounds. They say they are sticking to the end of the Brexit transition period being the 31st of December. Many of us, including myself, will make the case for changing that, but we have to accept that parliamentary arithmetic down in Westminster is not in our favour. But we would be fools to gamble on winning an argument anyway with that large majority. When that happens, we will, farmers and farming will be hit at precisely a moment when its already huge importance is growing even more. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, Stuart has said to relate to you today that it's incumbent on us to support this bill and to guarantee our farmers some certainty now. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. We now come to closing speeches. Can I remind members of the importance of maintaining social distancing, especially when entering and leaving the chamber? And I call Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As I said in my opening comments, Labour support the bill at stage one because we understand its importance. However, I would reiterate the comments that I made earlier that delaying this debate by a couple of weeks so members who are unable to attend today could have participated virtually would not have in any way detracted from that importance. We've already seen a number of members given proxy speeches when there would have been an opportunity in a couple of weeks for those members to be present virtually. More importantly, it would have allowed what would have been the first substantive debate on the crisis that we face over COVID-19 to have taken place this week instead of waiting more weeks before that debate takes place. And I do wonder what our constituents must think about our priorities. But while we support this bill today, we also want to see improvements as it passes through the parliamentary process. So I welcome the commitment of the Cabinet Secretary to work with other parties to hopefully deliver the changes we need. A recurrent theme throughout today's debate has been the concerns from stakeholders over the lack of clarity and direction from government both during the transitionary period but also when it comes to beginning the process of developing a new agricultural support scheme. At every step of the way, it seems that it's stakeholders, not government, that have in many ways led the way. NFU Scotland, Scottish Environment Link, Scottish Land and Estates have all set out proposals for a new system and how we use this transition period to begin the process to move to that new system, while WWF have produced detailed policy options for reducing emissions. We've seen little information from government since their Stability and Simplicity document was published almost 2 years ago. The only changes suggested so far are the largely technical ones set out by the Simplicity Task Force. We've had no detail on what other changes are being considered to improve or simplify the Common Agricultural Policy implementation in Scotland. No detail on what the pilot schemes may cover, what the budget could be, or how they will be funded. The transition period must be used to lay the groundwork for the new system, developing and trialling schemes and, crucially, providing training to ensure that farmers and crofters are equipped to deal with any new system. Presiding Officer, put simply, the bill as it stands is a missed opportunity to deliver clear direction for the sector to transition towards. The sooner we have a clear vision of what we want to replace CAP, the more effectively we will be able to use the transition period to develop the detail. The clock is ticking. As many members have highlighted during the debate, a purpose clause would provide more of the clarity on the direction of travel, while a sunset clause would provide more certainty on the timescales for bringing us towards that new system. There's very much still a discussion to be had on the exact wording of a potential purpose clause, and I look forward to having those discussions. But it is clear that a majority of members recognise there are clear benefits to setting out a clear set of principles in the legislation. This will provide reassurance on the long-term direction of agricultural policy and will help to address reservations about the broad enabling powers included in this bill by providing a set of guiding principles for the use of these powers. Likewise, a sunset clause would simply provide a statutory basis for commitments this government have already made. The Cabinet Secretary has consistently stated that this transition period will only last until 2024, and underpinning this commitment in law will provide a welcome guarantee that this remains the case. And as I've said, any sunset clause should of course include the option of an extension in order to avoid a cliff edge. It's simply a matter of making clear that the default is for this legislation to be temporary, in line with the government's own desire. Establishing a new system within the proposed timeline is essential, and passing this bill with no time limit sends the wrong message. CAP funding is a lifeline for this key sector, but the current system we know is not fit for purpose. We need a new system which distributes funding more fairly, supporting and incentivising sustainability and environmentally friendly practices, protecting and enhancing animal welfare while building a more productive and resilient industry. There's a clear consensus among stakeholders on the need for a system which delivers on both environmental aims and productivities. Indeed, the sector faces ambitious targets on carbon reduction from the Climate Change Act and on productivity from Ambition 2030, and urgently needs a support system which better enables these aims to be met. A support system with environmentalism at its heart will allow the agriculture sector to make the emission reductions needed. Equally, any new agricultural support system must also underpin productivity and growth as well as environmentalism. These two aims should not be brought to be thought of as competing, and it's critical that neither is achieved at the expense of the other. The bill does not set out a detailed long-term plan for agriculture, and no one is arguing that it should. But what is clear is that it should provide more direction, and failing to do so is a missed opportunity. Presiding Officer, it would also be a missed opportunity not to wake up to the fact that the world has changed in recent weeks. The COVID-19 crisis is first and foremost a public health crisis, but it's also a crisis that has exposed the need for a fairer, healthier and more sustainable food system. With the Good Food Nations Bill dropped because of that crisis, we need to adapt. It can't be business as usual. We should take those elements of the Good Food Nations Bill, which the government supports, and incorporate them in this agricultural bill. And that includes a statutory commitment to a statement of policy on food. It would be a dereliction of duty not to take this urgent opportunity to better safeguard our fragile food system as best we can against future crises, shoring up our resilience and future food security. That statement of policy should include a contingency planning for tackling future interruptions to supply. Presiding Officer, if this isn't the time to do that, then I simply do not know when that time will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I call on Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be closing in today's Stage 1 debate for the Scottish Conservatives. But like others on these benches, I make this contribution on behalf of a member who cannot be here in the Parliament today to deliver it in person, in this case, Finlay Carson, who is at home in his constituency in beautiful Galloway. Can I also refer members to my own register of interest in relation to me being a partner in the farming business of J. Howker Johnson and Sons, and also to both Finlay Carson and my own membership of the National Farmers Union of Scotland. We have heard some strong contributions from members across the chamber reflecting the circumstances the agriculture sector finds itself in, like every other sector, as a result of COVID-19. They have not been immune to the challenges, and that makes today's debate an important stage in ensuring that the agricultural sector has the clarity and policies in place that will help them emerge stronger from this crisis, and also in the years ahead when we are beyond the transitional period from leaving the European Union. As highlighted by my colleagues on these benches, we are supportive of the general principles of this bill, but today's debate has highlighted the need for the proper frameworks and funding mechanisms to emerge through the future stages of this bill. As Deputy Convener of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee, Finlay Carson has highlighted that the principles of this bill must be designed with any environmental concerns in mind. The COVID crisis has inadvertently seen benefits to our environment with less emissions from many sources, as we have seen less activity. However, that does not mean we can be complacent about the massive challenges we face in tackling climate change, and our agricultural sector is at the heart of that, and it is ready and willing to take up the challenge. As Finlay Carson has often said in this chamber and at committee, we cannot continue to allow the agriculture sector to be demonised when it comes to the challenges of reducing emissions and enabling better practices. Agriculture has stepped forward and started to address these issues. The industry, including the NFUS, have long recognised the part that they must play in achieving the ambitious 75% reduction in emissions by 2030 on the way to hitting the net zero target by 2045. As we know, there is to be an unfortunate but inevitable delay in an update to the climate change plan. And this delay makes it even more important that the right policies are in place throughout this agricultural bill. Faster and further is what is still required when it comes to addressing climate change. It is therefore very disappointing that there has not been greater urgency from the SNP government in outlining a plan of action. The Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee understands that their period of simplification and improvement will run until 2024. We need to get it right now, and who knows when we will fully emerge from the COVID-19 crisis. But there also needs to be a sense of urgency when we do to outline how future policy will be developed. Stability is key for the industry in the coming years, but change also must be instigated if the industry are to firstly adapt, then change, and ultimately to deliver. We've already heard from the Chief Executive of the Committee on Climate Change UK that the Scottish Government's plans for a long-term policy framework to replace the EU Common Agricultural Policy are lagging behind both England and Wales. On environmental schemes, the funding for environmental and climate management interventions is a serious area of concern, with the provisions in the bill as it stands giving limitations on sources of funding and potentially even more seriously, if not introduced carefully, capping on the funding. This would mean that the agricultural sector could lose out on lowering specific sectoral emissions as part of the overall work to reduce emissions. When it comes to environmental standards, it is absolutely vital that there is a common framework agreed across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom in order to maintain that commitment to the highest possible environmental standards. The same principles should apply when it comes to the agricultural regulatory frameworks that ultimately end up as part of this bill. The integrity of the UK single market is absolutely vital for the industry, so it is critical they work within a commonly agreed framework. There is flexibility when it comes to the playing field, as is currently the case, but the whole of the UK must play within the same set of rules. One area of Mr Carson's constituency of Galloway and West Dumfries, as well as with other areas of Scotland that are going to be vital in the coming years, are that of agri-tourism monitor farms. It's been welcome to see that groups have been set up to provide further support and expertise as the programme continues. And that is exactly what is going to be needed, with the tourism industry being one of the hardest hit during the coronavirus crisis. The diversification of farming businesses is an area which can help to sustain farming businesses going forward. And I've been asked to highlight Monitor Farms, which have sold £20,000 worth of farming tools for the spring and summer seasons already on such things as lambing experiences. But this cash has obviously already been spent. Tourism income aside, there is the urgent need to get the policies in place that recognise the huge potential role Monitor Farms can play in testing and providing future policy with regards to climate change and the protection of biodiversity. The principle of Monitor Farms has been proven, and they are widely accepted and respected as the right way forward by the agriculture sector. The Monitor Farm model should form the foundation of future pilot schemes as soon as possible, and delay is no good for anyone. Deputy Presiding Officer, the Agriculture Bill is absolutely vital, but we must ensure that we get it right. With the current state of affairs, it is important that the sufficient time will be set aside by the government, alongside requisite measures in order to ensure that the right scrutiny can take place at stage 2 of this bill, which is where these benches will seek to ensure that our industry will be protected in terms of resources, policies, and the highest possible standards in the years to come in a world outside of the European Union.
Thank you very much. And I call on Fergus Ewing to conclude the debate. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think in these times, I do feel that those listening to the debate, particularly those interested in farming and the rural economy, do want to see politicians working together. And I think largely that's what we've seen this afternoon. So I really very much appreciate the clear statements from, I think, all the leading opposition party spokespeople that they will be supporting the general principle of the bill. And for my part, you know, I'm keen, as always, to try to work with members to improve the bill insofar as it can. And I'll just restate that for the record. And I thought there were some very good contributions from Mr. Cameron, from Liz Smith, from Mike Rumbles, the convener of the committee, gave a fair account of the committee's report, I thought, and other contributions from other parties, I thought, made a very useful, positive remark. So I just start off by thanking members broadly for the spirit of the debate. I do think that, though, that this is an important debate. I contest the fact that we could postpone this. This needs to be done. Farmers want us to do our work. They expect us to do our work. This doesn't need to be passed this month or next month, but it does need to be passed within a time limit. And we don't want to leave things to the last moment, so we need to get on with our work. And I do think the public would expect us to do that, and I think it's important to say that. I also absolutely agree that members are keen to debate the longer-term policy with regard to farming, with regard to the environment, with regard to food production, with regard to animal welfare standards. Many members quite rightly mentioned these points, and these are all very fair points indeed. But what I would say is that whilst they're fair points, they're not directly relevant to the purpose of this bill. This bill is about a mechanism. It's about a process. It's providing a lever. It's a tool in the box. It's a spanner that enables us to do a specific task. Spanners aren't designed to save the planet. They're designed to do something specific. This is what some legislation, Presiding Officer, is about, and this is one of these things. That doesn't mean, and I don't... Well, hang on a second. I'll give way in a minute. That doesn't mean that members are not making valid points. It's just that, with all due respect, some of the points are just really not directly relevant to what our job is today and in this bill. I'll certainly give way.
Mark Ruskell.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way? As I understand it, the core purpose of this bill is to ensure alignment with the EU Common Agricultural Policy. In 2021, that policy will change. There will be 9 new objectives that the EU will set. If we want to stay aligned with the EU, we need to incorporate those objectives into our own agricultural policy. Surely he can see that our best chance perhaps of rejoining the EU, maybe as an independent nation, would be through alignment with the EU CAP for 21 to 27. Incorporate these objectives into this bill.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that's an interesting point, but it's actually not the purpose of this bill, and the purpose of this bill is really rather different. Of course, this government absolutely believes that EU membership, as I stated earlier, is the best option for Scotland and indeed the UK. But this bill is specifically to allow us to make simplification and improvement of the operations of the EU legislation. Without that, we're unable to do that. That's the purpose of this bill. And I don't think there's any point in labouring this, but I do hope that most members will feel that in making these points, I'm being absolutely sincere about the nature of our function, our purpose, our job today. And it's not that I'm critical necessarily of differing points of view. It's a perfectly legitimate debate. It's just not for today, and it's not for this bill. And it won't be for this bill in stages 2 or 3 either. And in respect of the clauses, the sunset clause and the purpose clause, these are important issues. And again, I think Mr. Rumbles made the key speech in this regard. And he also went further because he actually suggested a specific alternative, which we don't very often hear on these particular benches and these types of debates. So that was interesting, and it will be considered carefully as I undertook, and we will have discussions, and that's all well and good. But, you know, I have to say, and I don't mean to be facetious or flippant in any way, I mean, I've met farmers very often at the behest of members. For example, Mr. Cameron invited me to meet some farmers from Lochaber, and we had a very serious discussion. They were very worried about future financial support. I think I was able, I hope, to provide some reassurance, particularly regarding the continuance of Less Favoured Area Support Scheme payments. And I think they welcomed that, and it was a very useful meeting. And I was grateful for Mr. Cameron for hosting it and arranging it. But I tell you this, there wasn't one crofter or farmer at that meeting that mentioned a purpose clause. There wasn't one farmer or crofter that mentioned a sunset clause. They will be interested in actual sunsets, but not legislative sunsets. And without in any way being facetious, these are not things that directly concern farmers. Now, yes, you may say, that's really not a purpose in raising this issue. It's about the long-term policy. Well, that's true. Of course, people are interested in long-term policy. But I would, I'll just finish the point, and then I'll certainly give away. But my point is this, that there's an awful lot that farmers and crofters have got to worry about at the moment. My goodness me, I don't really have to enumerate them. I think Gillian Mitchell made the point very well, although she was, of course, in part, I don't know whether it was an impersonation of Stuart Stevenson or whether it was an offering of Stuart Stevenson. It was certainly a very interesting and unusual contribution, which was thoroughly enjoyed. But she made some very good points indeed, that farmers' concerns at the moment are very practical, they're very down to earth, they welcome the effort that we're putting in to continue to make sure that they get their financial support in their bank account, and I think they were grateful and satisfied that we secured that to the tune of 81% of the CAP payments, over £340 million of loan payments, £430 million of Pillar 1 payments, and £80 million approximately of convergence payments just before lockdown, in fact, weeks before lockdown. And the fact that we were able to do that as a government and complete these complex tasks thanks to the diligence of public servants throughout the country in ARPID is something that is really important to them, rather than the minutiae of a purpose clause or a sunset clause, which, as I say, no farmer or crofter has ever mentioned to me.
Smith. I think the Cabinet Secretary is absolutely correct that farmers are absolutely concerned about the practicalities just now. But he's also concerned from the aspect that this bill is about procedures. And the whole debate about the sunset clause is about the scrutiny level that can be given to decisions that are being made. And as it stands just now, there is concern that the Scottish Government could, if it so wished, take that decision into its own hands. That's not right from parliamentary democracy.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I earlier said I thought Liz Smith made a good contribution, and I think she has made a further a very worthwhile point, well made. I totally agree, and I agreed when I responded to Mr Rumbles that these are very important points for us as parliamentarians. The distinction I was trying to make, and I hope I've made, Presiding Officer, is that for farmers, they're perhaps of less interest than the practicalities, something I think Ms Smith agreed. So we will come back to these. We want to be sure that as a government we are subjected to appropriate scrutiny. We've never shied away from that, and we're not going to be starting that now. With regard to the non-regression issue, and this I think several members raised this, I would say that actually the non-regression issue is in a sense already dealt with by previous legislation that we have passed the Climate Change Emissions Targets Scotland Act 19, the Nature Conservation Act 2004. These are all legislative provisions, Presiding Officer, which are the law. We must abide by these, and rightly so, and these already commit us to non-regression. So if there is a thesis that somehow we could do all sorts of regressive things, we can't, because we're constrained by the law and the law is in place. Presiding Officer, I have no idea how much time I've got, so I can fill whatever time you want.
If the member wishes to draw his remarks to the conclusion now, I'm sure that would be
I
most
hear
welcome.
suggestions that winding up would be appropriate. Not for the first time, it has to be said, when I've been standing in this place. Presiding Officer, just to bring things to a close today, I was very grateful for the broad approach of members. I think we are doing a good thing in scrutinising this legislation. I'm sure that we will make some progress in stages 2 and 3, and I very much look forward to working with members across this chamber to do what we can to make sure that we will be able to adapt our policy in a way that will help farming and crofting, will help the environment, will enable continued high-quality food to be produced and food security to be observed in an increasingly uncertain planet. So thank you very much to all members today, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in this spirit in the weeks to come.
And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his contribution? And that concludes our debate on the Stage 1 debate on the Agricultural Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill. The next item is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 21664 on committee membership. And could I call on Graham Day to move this bill?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. Now, I'm minded to accept a motion without notice to bring forward decision time to now. Could I invite Graham Day to move such a motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I will now put the question. The question is that decision time be brought forward to now. Does everyone agree? Yes. We do. Excellent. So there are two questions today. The first question is that motion 21650 in the name of Fergus Ewing on the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. And the final question is that motion 21664 in the name of Graham Day on committee membership be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time. I would just urge members, when leaving the chamber, just to do so in a safe way, observing social distance. And I now close this meeting.